Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German economist, sociologist, and philosopher. He was born on the 5th of May 1818 in Trier, which was then part of the Prussian Rhineland, and died in London on 14 March 1883. After living in Prussia, Marx lived in France for some time, and that is where he met his lifelong friend Friedrich Engels. Today he is most well known for his works on the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. The Communist Manifesto, originally the Manifesto of the Communist Party, is an 1848 political pamphlet by German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Commissioned by the Communist League and originally published in London in German, just as the revolutions of 1848 began to erupt, the manifesto was later recognized as one of the world's most influential political documents. It presents an analytical approach to the class struggle, historical and then present, and the problems of capitalism and the capitalist mode of production. The Communist Manifesto summarizes Marx and Engels' theories about the nature of society and politics. It also briefly features the ideas for how the capitalist society of the time would eventually be replaced by socialism. The Communist Manifesto is split into 4 sections. In the first section, it discusses the communist theory of history and the relationship between proletarians and the bourgeoisie. The second section explains the relationship between the communists and the proletarians. The third section addresses the flaws in other previous socialist literature. And finally, the last section discusses the relationship between the communists and other parties. Das Kapital. Published in 1867, Das Kapital is essentially a description of how the capitalist system works and how Marx claims it will destroy itself. Marx had already set out his ideas on class struggle, how the workers of the world would seize power from the ruling elites in the Communist Manifesto and in his other writings. There is a strong economic focus to this work, and Marx addresses the nature of commodities, wages, and the worker-capitalist relationship, labor markets, the division of labor, and a basic understanding of the rate of return to owners of capital. Much of this work tries to show the ways in which workers are exploited by the capitalist mode of production. He also provides a history of past exploitations. Marx argues that the capitalist system is ultimately unstable because it cannot endlessly sustain profits. Like other classical economists, Karl Marx believed in the labor theory of value to explain relative differences in market prices. This theory stated that the value of a produced economic good can be measured objectively by the average number of labor hours required to produce it. In other words, if a table takes twice as long to make as a chair, then the table should be considered twice as valuable. Marx understood the labor theory better than his predecessors and contemporaries and presented a devastating intellectual challenge to laissez-faire economists in Das Kapital. If goods and services tend to be sold at their true objective labor values, as measured in labor hours, how do any capitalists enjoy profits? It must mean, Marx concluded, that capitalists were underpaying or overworking and thereby exploiting laborers to drive down the cost of production. While Marx's answer was eventually proved incorrect, and later economists adopted the subjective theory of value, his simple assertion was enough to show the weakness of the labor theory's logic and assumptions. Marx unintentionally helped fuel a revolution in economic thinking. Volume 1 was published in 1867, and the later 2 volumes, heavily edited by Engels, was published in 1885 and 1894. Marx was inspired by classical political economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, while his own branch of economics, Marxian economics, is not favored among modern mainstream thought. Nevertheless, Marx's ideas have had a huge impact on societies, most prominently in communist projects such as those in the USSR, China, and Cuba. Among modern thinkers, Marx is still very influential among the fields of sociology, political economy, and strands of heterodox economics. Marx built on the analysis of a number of earlier socialist writers, most notably Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Henry de Saint-Simon, who had from around 1815 onwards contended that capitalism needed to be replaced by a system based on common ownership and/or management. By 1845, Marx became convinced that capitalism, that is, an economic and political system based on competition in the market and increasing technological advancement, was vulnerable to a process of recurring cyclical crisis in which wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of few. Marx was, as much as anything else, a visionary who gave hopes to millions that a life of endless, exhausting, exploited toil was not an inevitable loss of humanity. He was essentially a utopian thinker, though he disliked the term, who posited the idea of a future good life and then demanded that humanity seek this end.